Hello, everyone, and welcome to Yellow Seeds 101 with the Writer. I am Brittany King, your host, and today we have Chloe Valdary, writer, artist, founder of Theory of Enchantment, podcast host of The Heart Speaks, and she recently wrote a piece for Yellow Seeds called The Pursuit of Nuance, and that's exactly what we'll be discussing today, along with her work. So welcome to Yellow Seeds, Chloe. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, Brittany. I'm doing well.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get straight into this. I'm excited to have you here today. So you took on this heavy task of tackling what you believe nuance is within this essay, and you framed your thoughts around many things, including great thinkers like Carl Jung and religious themes like the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. And the reason why I describe this as a heavy task is because nuance is a very subjective topic, and there's various ways in how people view it and apply it to their own lives. But on a large scale in America, it seems like there's many versions of this, but it's been ineffective for people on how to truly engage with other individuals or other people, ideas that they don't completely understand or that they oppose. But from my point of view and from what I've seen from your work in this piece, it seems that your outlook and practice of nuance has been overtly effective on how you've been able to engage with the public on polarizing issues and topics, while showing your journey with seeking understanding with diverse perspectives. So I want to open the conversation with you sharing the moment that you collided up against nuance, because it's rarely something that people innately practice from the jump. It usually takes like a pivotal moment or a unique experience that one shifts into this gray area. So my question for you is, when did you take this shift into this gray space of nuance?
So I think that, in order to shift, as you describe it, into the space of nuance. Oh, should I start over? Sorry, did you hear that in the background? Now I can't hear you. Hold on. Let me just.
You hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm gonna get rid of it. Okay. So to answer your question about shifting into nuance, I actually think, in my experience, what precluded my shift into nuance was the experience of suffering. And I'm not sure that you can actually shift into nuance without experiencing suffering. And the way I experienced it was, I grew up with a very religious, dogmatic, or religiously dogmatic way of viewing the world. I grew up in a house and with a faith that was very strict on certain rules and ways of being in the world, and in a house that defined Christianity, or what it means to be a Christian, in a very tight way. And then when I went to college, I took a class with a professor who I think she identified as an agnostic. And she also identified as a believer, or excuse me, not as a believer, that wouldn't make sense, as a liberal. And in the house that I grew up, whether you were atheist or you were liberal, all of those were non-starters. So my professor is an agnostic liberal, so I'm automatically putting her in a box. When I meet her, I automatically assume certain things about her lived experience, about her ideas, etc. And then one day she assigns us to this film called Jesus Camp, which follows the lives of, I think, evangelical parents who send their kids to this camp where they sort of learn how to speak in tongues. That's sort of like the punchline. And the parents are not exactly portrayed in a positive light. They're seen as very dogmatic and let's just leave it at that, dogmatic. And when I got back to school, I was expecting my professor, who was an agnostic and a liberal, to have certain opinions about this. But then there was actually a student who was an atheist, who was like a radical atheist, who started railing on these parents, who started really calling them names and denigrating them. And then my professor actually started to defend the parents. And she started to say that if you don't understand how people can be coming from a place of need whether it's a need for belonging, a need for ritual, a need for sort of losing yourself in ritual, and that these are basic human needs that we all crave. If you don't understand how that could drive parents to do this, to send their children to this camp, then you haven't grasped the purpose of this class. And that was a real rude awakening, because that completely caused me depression, because I was, for the first time, experiencing someone who did not fit into my box of what it meant to be a Christian or what it meant to be a good person, quite frankly. Extending grace and compassion to people who were religious, which meant that the boxes I had used to define the world and my reality were no longer sufficient. So it felt like a free-for-all, which led to me experiencing a great deal of depression for a number of years, actually. But it was that realization that my boxes didn't work, of the paradigm that I was operating through wasn't actual reality. That experience of suffering is actually what brought me eventually to discover nuance as a kind of way of being, not just a sort of word we throw around, loosely on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And that speaks to a lot that I want to get into with Christianity and the themes that I'm seeing in this piece. And getting into your piece, The Pursuit of Nuance, you stated that the pursuit of nuance in philosophy, political or otherwise, is a sign of maturity because it is the acceptance of reality, of the undeniable fact that mankind is messy, will always be messy, and that this such messiness is the cost of being able to experience life. And to make peace with this fact, mankind must assimilate with their shadow and their light. And then you go on to describe the shadow in first person, stating it contains all those things that you're terrified to know that you're capable of. And this speaks to what you're just talking about and how that movie influenced you. Can you talk more about the shadow and light concept and why it's so important for mankind to learn how to assimilate with both their shadow and our light?
Sure. So the shadow is a term that was coined by Carl Jung, who is, someone who I certainly have learned a lot from and have studied a lot in the past few years. I've studied a lot of his work, but the shadow is basically all those unknown elements about ourselves that we often are unconscious of. And we can become sort of, even though we're unconscious of them, we can project them onto others. So for example, let's say there's a man who is triggered by another man who is prone to violence. So by triggered, I mean, every time he sees this other man, he feels a kind of superiority complex where he starts to think that he's existentially better than this person. If he were to engage in shadow work, where, there's a piece of shadow work where you're asked to identify a behavior in someone else that triggers you, that makes you feel superior, and then identify how that behavior shows up within you, or identify how that impulse towards that behavior shows up within you. And so if this man were to do shadow work, he might discover that the reason why he's triggered by this other person is because he actually has a desire to be violent. And he hasn't accepted that because of a whole host of reasons, right? Perhaps he's feeling shame because in society, it's taboo or it's frowned upon to want to be violent, right? Perhaps he's fearful of that impulse. Perhaps he's afraid of how people will perceive him if they know that he wants to be violent. Mm-hmm. So instead of allowing himself to bring that to consciousness and relate to it, he will suppress it and it'll be a part of his shadow and he'll project it onto another human being. Now, the path to wholeness for this person's situation will require that he make peace with his impulse or with his desire to be violent. And he can do this, by the way, by taking up a martial art or by pursuing some other course where he can actually be violent in a way that is contained and channeled, right? And this will make him less likely to be triggered by this other gentleman who's prone to violence, but also give him a capacity to again channel that impulse within him in a healthy way. And so you can think of the shadow as all those things that we're unaware of for a whole host of reasons, because we might be ashamed of it, fearful of it, felt not wanting to take responsibility for it. So that's really what the shadow is. And once we bring consciousness to those elements of ourselves, then we can actually sort of kind of speaking, bring those things into the light in the sense that we've become aware of them. We've decided to consciously take responsibility for them. And that's how the integration of one's shadow and one's light can occur. But the shadow will always exist. There's no such thing as, vanquishing the shadow or defeating the shadow, nor should there be a desire to defeat it, right? Mm-hmm. Rather, the desire should be to learn how to relate to all of the different aspects of ourselves and of our personality. And as human beings, we're constantly transforming and changing and becoming. We're not static, So this is why there will always be the shadow, and there will always be new things to discover about ourselves that are part of our shadow.
I really enjoyed the breakdown that you did with the shadow and light, because it just speaks to this wholeness that people seem to be missing that's a part of humanity. And I would say, I think from my point of view, like for the past 5, 6, 7 years, the idea of nuance has started to make its way to mainstream conversations. But it seems as though there's like this key missing part that people still misunderstood, which speaks to what you just said about this humility component. And that nuance is like this sense of grace that's not only given but received, which implies the imperfectness and the messiness that lives within us all that you talked about in the piece. Also in the piece, you discussed how people hide themselves by projecting their darkness onto themselves. And you gave this really great illustration of like American slavery, of how, European slave owners projected their darkness onto the Africans they sold and enslaved by creating this dangerous idea of what they thought Black was to them. Why do you think people are just so afraid of their own imperfections, and that people just project their flaws onto others? And then as a society, why do you think we're just unwilling to give each other like a benefit of the doubt, a break, just the fact that we're all broken and messy?
Well, I think that it's really hard. I think it's really hard to allow yourself to be vulnerable with yourself and vulnerable with others. I mean, we crave human connection, and we're afraid that if we reveal ourselves to the world, that we won't be worthy of connection, or we won't find connection reciprocated, a desire to connect reciprocated back at us. So it's very hard to sort of surrender to the practice of allowing yourself to be vulnerable. It's hard for me, and I teach this kind of stuff and I talk about it. So I think it's a very human thing to resist that what I would call the deeper spiritual move towards nuance, because it requires us to be open and honest with ourselves and open and honest with the rest of society, without, while knowing that there's a chance that people in society might not respond in the reciprocal way. What was your second question?
Second question was, let's see, why do you just think society just will not allow people just to be humans, and that we're all messy, we're all broken, no one has it together?
I don't know that we know how to do that yet. I think, especially in America, America has a very puritanical roots and very Calvinist roots, very Protestant roots. And historically speaking, that paradigm has viewed a lot of what we're talking about in punitive ways. So if you make a mistake, if you commit a crime, then that is all that you are, right? You are defined as a criminal. You have always been a criminal. You will always be a criminal. And of course, our justice system and the way we treat people who are let's say, coming out of prisons and trying to enter back into society, the way we treat people reflects that value system. The way we treat ourselves reflects that value system, right? We tend to be very hard on ourselves if we make mistakes, even in an interpersonal, non-criminal way. And so I think that there's a certain way of being that has been baked into our culture for a number of years. And it isn't to say that that has been merely or purely bad, right? There's a time and place for everything, I think. And if we have an impulse to be punitive, it's one thing to act on that impulse unconsciously, right? It's another thing entirely to relate to that impulse and ask ourselves, where is that impulse coming from? What need is not being met that might be driving that impulse? How can we perhaps satisfy that impulse in a way that's contained and healthy? So it isn't to, try to denigrate our history by me pointing this out, but that does play a role in how we've been socialized and brought up to deal in, very black and white frames, as opposed to that nuanced shade that I spoke about in the piece.
Mm-hmm. And dovetailing off that, I really enjoyed the empathy that you inserted throughout this piece, along with the vulnerability to express your missteps, specifically with judging others. You stated in essence how you used to make quick judgments, but that you no longer do this, or more so, you're more aware not to do this because you realize, which you stated in the piece, that your judgment is useless and changes nothing. And that instead that you come to accept the opposition exists. And you described it as it, and we'll get more into that. And that this type of realization you stated is hard teaching. And I want to break this down a bit, but first I want to ask you about your sentiment around judgment. It was centered around our polarizing race conversation. Did it take a specific race-based topic or conversation like that to come to the conclusion on judgment? Or was it just a realization, like a general judging people on all fronts just doesn't work?
So I think it was a process. At some point, I picked up the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, which talks about non-judgment. At some point, I got tired of, quite frankly, attacking Ibram Kendi on Twitter. It just wasn't fruitful for me. It was exhausting.
Reclaiming your time.
Yeah. Yeah. But specifically, what Marshall Rosenberg says in his book is that judgment is is another form of expression of an unmet need. Like, if someone is acting racist towards me, if I simply call that action bad, and let's say they stop doing what they're doing because I call that action bad. They've stopped doing what they're doing, not of their own volition and not of a conscious desire to change, but simply because I've shamed them into doing it, because I've called them bad and they don't want to be bad, And so we're back into the shadow, right? Because maybe there are impulses within me that would be labeled bad. And I have to learn how to be in right relationship with those, not deny them, not repress them, because if I do that, then I will just project them onto others. And then it becomes this never ending cycle. And so that is why my judgment, in a sense, is useless. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, if I am a judge in a court of law, it is literally my job to judge, to pass judgment, right? So there are different places where this might apply, or where it might not apply. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about trying to create an environment in which people change of their own volition, which is to say in a sustained way, then judgment is not going to actually produce that in the long term.
And I want to talk about the end part of that paragraph. And you talked about it right here a bit. You said that you've come to accept it and that you cannot change unless you first accept it. This is hard teaching. Mm-hmm. When I read this, I felt like you're basically saying that you've come to accept that things you completely disagree with are still options for people to mm-hmm. believe. And denying that actually stalls one ability to be nuanced, because I feel like now people feel like being nuanced is just listening to someone you disagree with, but still trying to get them to agree with you.
Right.
Like people sit down to be like, okay, I'm going to get this person on my side, but don't realize like, no, they really can believe that even after these conversations that we had. Is that what you meant by that passage, or am I completely off?
I think it's definitely related. I have learned a great deal from Jungian, I guess you would call it writings on the concept of the masculine and the feminine. And when many Jungian authors speak about the feminine, they're not necessarily speaking about gender. They're speaking about a kind of, let's say, aspect of reality that has existed since the beginning of time. And it's complementary to the masculine. But one of the attributes of the feminine is receptivity, the ability to be receptive to another human being when that person is sharing their story, or sharing their opinion, or sharing their viewpoint, or whatever, you know? And the capacity to be receptive, and this is a skill set I have not mastered. I struggle with this. But the capacity to be receptive and to hold space for someone without trying to change their mind or control or possess, but for the sake of relating, right, which is the root word of relationship, is something that is what I was trying to get at in that sentence. And what I have learned is that if a person can learn to be with what is, they might be surprised at how transformational that practice becomes. Because life is constantly changing. And if you can learn how to be with what is, then automatically another what is will occur. Exactly. So if I can be receptive to Ibram Kendi, not agreeing with him, but if I can be receptive and hold space for him without trying to change his opinion or change his perspective or change his, the paradigm through which he views the world, I have no idea what would happen. But the very practice of trying to be receptive, I think, is a value in and of itself. And we don't know how to do that anymore, especially with, we haven't known how to do that for a long time, but especially with social media, which is constantly distracting us. Like, how can I be receptive to you if I'm constantly getting notifications on my phone that are like dragging me away from this conversation? Or even if I'm wondering in the back of my head, like, is this tweet going to get 1 million likes? Is it getting 1 million likes now? I can't practice the art, right? The feminine art, which any human being can practice, of being receptive, of practicing receptivity, which is necessary and critical if you want to be able to pursue nuance.
Mm-hmm. I love that you shared that. And this brings me to, we are talking about with Christianity, because it's funny, because when I read this piece, and I don't really know like what you identify as, I'm Christian. And it's hard to say I'm Christian because that means so many different things. I believe in Jesus Christ. Let's just say that. Sure. And I can't help but see, the religious themes that you had within this piece that illustrate a larger point. And I've seen this in other works that you've done. In this piece in particular, you talked about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And then in other words, you focused on legendary believers like of Christ, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin, who I love, and I know that you love too. And you talked a lot about their philosophy of love. And I'd argue they were very, very nuanced and unorthodox before their time. Mm-hmm. Do you see an overlap of nuanced practices in Christianity beliefs, and not necessarily like the Christianity that, scolds people, that people like kind of manufacture, but the actual Christian faith? Do you see how these worlds kind of collide in similar ways?
I think Christianity is very complicated.
Amen.
I don't want to give a boilerplate answer, but I do think it's quite complicated. I grew up in a Christian sect that kept Jewish festivals, right? So it was very paradoxical. And in a way, the metaphors of Christianity will always be baked into me. I can't help it because that's how I was raised. I certainly think that there are a lot of, well, perhaps not a lot, but there are certainly notable, followers of the Christian wisdom tradition that were able to experience or practice that nuance. Dr. King, obviously being one of them, but the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who King was deeply inspired by, was super, super into a lot of what we're talking about. I mean, I've been inspired by reading a lot of his essays. So Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich was another Protestant theologian who was able to see or understand Christianity in what I would describe as a mystical understanding, as opposed to a literalist interpretation of Christianity. And King had a little bit of that in him as well. And there was so much of my upbringing and the way I viewed Christianity as a literalist sort of take. And for me personally, that just doesn't work. It just doesn't, a literal interpretation of Christianity just doesn't make sense to me. And I think that the people who are able to apply Christianity to the pursuit of nuance, to the pursuit of that unconditional love that is so preached in Christianity, I think that those people are the people whose understanding was a blend of both a literalist interpretation and a more mystical interpretation, which is in itself a form of nuance, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, but Christianity is complicated. That's my take.
It's so complicated. It is one of those things where I don't want to like shy away from saying that I am one, but then I don't want people to like assume what they think, because it's very subjective, which it should be objective in a sense. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And this brings me to your anti-racist training, because not only do you talk about nuance and give your principles and your ideas, but you like have made training in a program for people to take to be actual in their life. And it's called the Theory of Enchantment, and it connects to your essay in a practical way. Can you give us a brief synopsis of this training for the audience that might not know what this is? And why did you want to create it? And how does it connect and tie into one's pursuit of nuance?
Sure. So the name of my company is called Theory of Enchantment, and it's an anti-racism or organization that provides anti-racist trainings, workshops, online courses. I'd say the crux of what we do is we really show people how, by not being in right relationship with different elements of themselves, they can then project it onto other people. And this is what supremacy fundamentally is. A supremacist, if you tear back the facade of feeling like you're better than everyone else, a supremacist is usually someone who actually deep down feels unworthy and deeply lacks self-esteem, and then overcompensates by projecting the feeling of superiority onto others in various ways. And so if you want to actually get at the root of supremacy, ironically or not, root is where the word radical comes from. If you want to actually get at that radical root of where supremacy emerges, you have to teach people how to get in right relationship with their full complexity, which is a lifelong, ongoing task, which will, last forever. And so we try to give people the tools and the skill sets to learn how to do that. And we do that partially by showing them stories that they're already familiar with, that are already a part of the pop culture, that actually are tools or are, things that they can think of when trying to recall some of the principles of the theory of enchantment, whether it's, treat people like human beings, not political abstractions, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy, and try to root everything you do in love and compassion. Those are the three principles. So that's what Theory of Enchantment is. I keep forgetting the other questions that you're asking because I get lost in the answers.
It's all good. I think you answered all. I was just saying, to give, a synopsis of the training, how it ties in with one's pursuit of nuance, which you talked about, people being understanding themselves and goes back to the shadow and the light and getting at that before they try to get at the world, cleaning them up, themselves up before. So,
yeah.
And you also say that, and I love this, you market your program as the best anti-racism training ever on Twitter. Why do you, or maybe not why do you, but what is the difference between your anti-racist training and then the other anti-racist training and diversity training programs that we see right now?
I think that a lot of the contemporary anti-racism trainings that are sort of in the market today, they don't actually fully comprehend the human condition. They don't understand that hatred is a way to numb pain. One of the great things that Baldwin once said was, he said, like, I suspect that people cling to their hatreds so much is because once they get rid of hatred, they will have to deal with pain. Right. And so I think that a lot of the contemporary programs out there fail to understand that symbiotic relationship between hate and an unwillingness or failure to just, I talked about being with what is, and if you're in pain, actually moving through that pain and sitting with that pain and relating to that pain, as opposed to wanting to numb it by going into hatred or projecting that pain onto others. So it doesn't understand that richness of the human condition. And what it ends up doing, because it fails to understand that, is it actually ends up perpetuating the same ways of being by, let's say, calling everything, and I talk about this in the piece, calling everything that is bad or that has been bad, that's been done in the past, like referring to all of that as quote unquote whiteness, right? Which, it's interesting, it's kind of an inversion of calling everything bad, everything that's bad and evil, blackness, right? We're just going to invert it, and we're just going to call it whiteness, right? And again, it's a failure to deal with the complexity of your being, because if you're just using blackness and whiteness as stand-ins for good and bad, well, guess what? You have good and bad within you. Every single human being has blackness and whiteness within them, regardless of how they define it, right? And so these contemporary programs do not dig into the juiciness of that, because they're still dealing with surface level analyses of what's actually going on. They also often talk about the system, right? As if we aren't the human beings who created the system. The system is within us. The system is not outside of us, right? It's within us and built by us and perpetuated by us. And so if you want to attack or change, transform the system, it is impossible unless you transform yourself. And it's so hard to transform yourself, let alone another human being, right? So let's start there to begin with.
Exactly. And getting deeper with your own self is something that you do great on your new podcast, The Heart Speaks. And as I mentioned before, Chloe just launched this, and it's on YouTube and it's on other streaming platforms, and it's launched this year. And for those that don't know, I appeared on Chloe's podcast with Coleman Hughes and Camille Foster, which was a lot of fun to be with those other point of views. But what was really awesome about this conversation was that you asked us things like beyond the politics, like you asked us things that would literally would allow our hearts to speak. See what I did there with that? Okay. But and some of those questions were deep. I was like, okay, it's like 10 a.m. It's a little early. No, but it was needed.
Yeah.
But I say all this to say you have great success with your writing and your Theory of Enchantment, other ventures that you do. What made you want to start this podcast?
That's a good question. I was I had an old podcast called Theory of Enchantment, and it was cool, but it wasn't getting views. And I do want my podcast to get views. So I teamed up with a producer, created a new podcast called The Heart Speaks. And we wanted to center on the heart because I do think that we live in a society, whether you're talking about the right or the left, I do think we live in a political culture that's very obsessed with the head. I grew up in I would say, arguably hyper-intellectual home, a very cerebral home. And there can become a problem if you are living in a hyper cerebral home because you forget that you have a body and that you have feelings and these things that also make you human. And in fact, you can start to suppress those things and see those things as less than. I have a serious ideological, or not even ideological, I have a serious moral problem with Ben Shapiro's line, facts don't care about your feelings. And I understand where it's coming from, and I can see the kernel of truth in it, but I can also see the kernels of untruth in it. We are terrified of relating to our feelings. We suppress our feelings. We deny that they exist. We think they're going to, sort of take us off into la la land. And the thing is, by denying them and by failing to acknowledge them, they actually will do that. Unconsciously. That's what happens. Mm-hmm. Right? So we called it The Heart Speaks because we really, my goal is to hopefully be able to cultivate a conversation where we're not just in our heads all the time. We understand that there's a symbiotic relationship between our brains and our body, and we're able to drop into the body because we can start to not be ashamed of it or afraid of it, and understand that it can give us wisdom in as much as the head can. But again, there's no distinction. It's the same. It's all the same being. And also the heart speaks, I think, speaks to at least a personal yearning for me to learn how to be more vulnerable and more receptive and more, willing to share some of those deep experiences that I've had, or fears that I've had, or insecurities that I've had with others, just for the sake of it. I mean, obviously I hope that people will be receptive back, but for the sake of actually practicing that art of sharing. And it's a dying art because we are constantly stuck in our heads. We over-intellectualize everything. Mm-hmm. So
I love that you said that about Ben Shapiro's sentiment about facts don't care about your feelings. I feel the same way about that. I know there's all this talk about using logic over emotions, but people act like they use logic so much and as if emotions aren't a part of their being anymore. It's like, it's going to come up somewhere. Yeah. And what you believe with passion, and that passion is your emotion. Yeah. And so I love that you get at this vulnerability and empathy on your podcast. I'm curious though, because you're always the one being interviewed. How does it feel to be on the other side of the mic and being the interviewer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm working through learning how to do that. Especially because some of the guests that I've had on have been a bit intellectual. And when I'm trying to get them to sort of drop into the heart, it can be hard or difficult. And maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just try to be receptive to how they are. Practice what I preach, But it's hard. It's not my natural inclination, I don't think. In a way it is, because I technically have to interview people as they come into my workshops. And it's kind of like I'm interviewing them. So maybe what I can do is try to apply what I've learned in facilitating workshops and try to do that when I'm interviewing people. Maybe that would be a better way to experiment, but I have found it very difficult.
Well, I love that you're being honest about that. And I love your podcast. I think you're doing an awesome job.
Thank you.
And it's not an easy task. It is not an easy task at all. I want to ask this because I love asking this question to podcast hosts, and it's very difficult, but it's fun for me to ask it. Okay. If you could interview two famous or historical figures on your podcast, dead or alive, who would they be? And briefly tell us why.
I would I'm going to say this I'm going to say it especially because there's something within my being that's saying, don't say that. I would love to interview J.K. Rowling.
Interesting.
I just recently, so background, I grew up in again, literalist, so therefore anti anything mystical. So I wasn't allowed to read or watch Harry Potter growing up. And I recently rewatched it. I mean, I watched it eventually when I became an adult, and then I recently rewatched it and actually paid attention to it when I rewatched it. And I was like, this is one of the most incredible, obviously, like things I've ever seen. So I want to ask her about that, but I also want to ask her about her particular, like, I don't want to say stance, because I think that is kind of reductive. I want to ask her about her relationship to the trans community and trans issues, especially because I'm like beginning to study again these concepts of the masculine and the feminine and the Jungian take on it. So I would love to just dive into that, because I read also somewhere that she's a huge fan of Carl Jung. So all the juiciness of that, I would love to get into that with her. So that's one person. And then another person, well, you said dead or alive. So if he was still alive, I would definitely like want to interview Albert Murray, because he was cool. He was a cool cat. Like he was like, blues and jazz critic. His mind was like insanely out of this world. He could go from talking to you about jazz to talk to you about like, I don't know, like postmodernism or something. He was really cool. I've read one of his books, and I've also like seen other people who actually knew him talk about like the impression that he made on them. So I would love to. He also had this like resiliency about him, and he was very much in touch with reality. I'd say in terms of that nuance, he talked about how this idea of it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing was not just a song. It was a symbolic representation of how to approach life. I mean, think about swinging between, I think he said, the vicissitudes of life, whether you're experiencing joy, whether you're experiencing suffering, right? Well, the thing is, there can be no joy without pain. There can be no good without bad. There can be no suffering without wholeness. These things are bounded together. And so if you can adopt that mentality of learning to swing between the ups and downs of life, if you can't do that, then it won't mean anything. There will be no meaning, right? So that song is very profound, and he like elucidates that in one of his books. So yeah, I would interview him.
Those are great choices, and I never had that profound knowing of that song, and now I do.
Me either.
Yeah, like this is what Chloe was saying. This is deep. Mine change all the time. Like I've said, like from Whitney Houston to James Baldwin to Dr. King to Rihanna. I'm going to say what I feel right now. Two people I want to interview right now on my podcast on YouTube would be Will Smith and Chris Rock. I would want that. Exclusive. I want that exclusive. I want to and put it
speak it into existence.
Yes, I want that. And like it could be like 2-3 hours. I don't know, but as long as they need, I want to be there. I want that. But yes, I digress on that. So my last question for you, because a lot of people look up to you to gain nuance, and I know a lot of people are going to love this essay when they read it. If there was like a nuanced cake that needed 3 key ingredients for it to be a true nuanced cake to be served to the public that would actually help us, what are those 3 things you think we need? Is it like empathy? Is it like, what 3 things do you think it would take?
Well, I would say definitely vulnerability, which is a capacity to relate to the unknown. If I were to give it a definition. Vulnerability. Empathy, which in its deepest sense actually means the capacity to suffer with someone else, because empathy comes from the word pathos. which denotes suffering specifically, not just like, any feeling in the world. So vulnerability, empathy, and then the third one would be unclinging. So a lot like, you don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing, requires capacity to refrain from clinging to any sort of like experience that you have and trying to grasp it and control it and make it last forever. Right? Because again, if there's no pain without joy, if you really couldn't experience joy unless you knew what pain was, right, then you would have to be able to let go of joy in order to really feel pain when you're experiencing pain. So yeah, a willingness to uncling and to swing is the third ingredient.
Basically that song. Everyone
Yes.
needs to listen to this song, and that will, while you're making the cake, listen to this. Thank you, Chloe. This has been so much fun talking to you and getting to know more about you and your theory and your practices and this essay. For everyone, if you have not read her piece, there will be a link to it below. Be sure to share. Also, if you want to follow her work, more information about that will be on the Yellow Seats publication. I am Brittany King. Thank you for tuning into Yellow Seats. Thank you for watching. And everyone, give Chloe a round of applause. Yes. I want to have some effect there, so it's not going to be awesome. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you. Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you.